This podcast is on social cognitive theory, which is chapter 5. We are going to begin by discussing the general principles that underline this theory. We'll talk about environmental factors related to social learning as well as cognitive factors involved with social learning. We're also going to talk a little bit about the idea of reciprocal causation, which Ormad introduces in your book, and then we'll discuss more in depth what modeling is kind of all about. The last part of the podcast will help you to differentiate between self-efficacy and self-regulation, and we'll discuss those theories a little, and then wrap up by talking about the educational implications of this theory. So we'll start by watching this brief video, which I think provides you a really nice overview of the theory.
It's 1961. You're wandering around Stanford University looking for a sandwich or something when you happen to walk by a particular room in a particular lab and see something a little unnerving. Namely, you find a woman punching an inflatable clown named Bobo in the neck, over and over in its neck. This was the lab of legendary psychologist Albert Bandura, and in 1961 he was studying one of the most important phenomena in psychology. See, while that woman was throttling that big inflatable clown, there was a child watching her, and after about 10 minutes of observing this clown-beating display, the kid was taken to a room full of fun toys, which were soon taken away, and then the frustrated kid was left alone with Bobo, and Bandura watched what happened. And yeah, what happened was kind of scary. Kids who watched the woman beating the clown were much more likely to mimic her aggression, kicking, punching, throwing, even attempting to maul Bobo with a hammer. But other children who saw an adult playing nicely with a doll or just ignoring it didn't respond the same way in their frustration. Bandura's results may seem predictable now, but in those days they challenged the dominant behaviorist views that we talked about last week. The views that learning is solely about conditioning and association, rewards and punishments. Bandura's research focused on how learning can occur through observing and imitating someone else's behavior. And if that seems obvious to you, you have Bandura to thank for that. His research hastened the evolution of 20th century experimental psychology from pure behaviorism into what we now know as social cognitive learning. While it was closely related to behaviorism, the social cognitive models added profoundly new dimensions to what Skinner and Watson and Pavlov had observed in our feathered and furry friends. In other words, it showed us that just as there is more than one way to beat up a clown, there's more than one way to learn. Last week we talked about the differences between classical and operant conditioning and associative learning, the kind of learning that comes from connecting different events and stimuli. In classical conditioning, this means associating a stimulus with some kind of involuntary response, the whole dog slobbering at the sound of a bell phenomenon, whereas operant conditioning makes associations between stimulus and a voluntary behavior, like the rat pressing a lever to get delicious snacks or jumping out of a cage to avoid an electric shock. And that's all well and good, but if learning is the process of acquiring and retaining new behavior and information, then Bandura's experiments showed us that conditioning with external rewards, punishment, or other stimuli isn't the only way to do it. It's hard to deny that pretty much all animals are capable of learning certain things by association, but critics of behaviorists like Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner had a problem with their assertions that when it came to learning, it didn't matter much whether you're training rats, pigeons, or people. It's all the same, because lots of research has demonstrated that an animal's capacity for conditioning is actually limited by its biology. Consider this scenario. Say, I get a raging case of food poisoning after eating my head weight in raw oysters with my friend Bernice. I'm probably not going to want to touch oysters again for a long, long time because I associate their smell and taste with the smell and taste that they made when they were coming back out. That's what I'm trying to say. But that doesn't mean that the sight of Bernice or the sound of the sea shanties that they were playing at the restaurant would make me bark, because humans are, by our very nature, more taste averse than we are sight or sound averse. On the other hand, sight-oriented animals like birds may be biologically predisposed to avoid tainted food by sight, since that's how they hunt and forage. And presumably they go to restaurants that play better music. Anyway, all this tells us that species can more easily learn associations that help them thrive or survive, and that not all associations are learned equally. It's a lot easier to teach a pigeon to peck an X on the ground to obtain a food reward than it is to get it to flap its wings to get that same reward, because pecking is a natural foraging behavior for a pigeon. In the same way, it would be much harder for the bird to learn to peck that X to avoid a shock rather than to flap its wings to avoid the shock, because because flying away from danger is what pigeons naturally do. Learned associations are even more complicated in humans, of course, because what we learn doesn't only influence our behavior, it also shapes our attitudes. Our cognition, that is, our thoughts, perspectives, and expectations, is important for learning, as is our social context, as Bandura figured out. So, Pavlov-style conditioning experiments that ignore those social cognitive elements can really run into trouble. For example, someone under treatment for an alcohol addiction may be given booze laced with a nauseating drug. According to the pure classical conditioning model, that person would then equate booze with feeling nasty. But the brain can override this association if it's aware that the added drug and not the alcohol is the thing that's causing the illness. Sometimes we can think our way out of intended associations. And by the same token, a person's social context, like their friends, family traditions, or life stressors, can reinforce something like alcohol consumption more than the nauseating pill could ever punish it. Plus, we also do a lot of latent learning, like without even knowing it. Have you ever been walking around a new city, someone stops you to ask for directions, and you surprise yourself by actually being able to tell that tourist how to get to the park? That's because we're constantly developing cognitive maps or mental representations of our surroundings without explicitly telling ourselves to do it. We've all seen the experiments with rats and mazes. Well, those show us that even rats develop these cognitive maps, figuring out how to get around even if there's no reward at the end. And days later, when they finally do get food at the end of the maze, they quickly demonstrate all that earlier latent learning by scuttling through the maze as fast or faster than rats that had been rewarded all along. So learning isn't just about associating a response with a consequence. There's thinking happening too. And this kind of thinking is also a big part of observational learning, which is basically learning by watching other people or being influenced by them in other ways. Because you don't need direct experience to learn. You can just pick stuff up through modeling. Not like modeling on the catwalk. I just mean observing and imitating specific behaviors. Rats, crows, pigeons, primates, and other animals learn through imitation. Chimps learn how to use sticks to fish ants out of a nest this way. One study found that rhesus macaques were usually slow to make up after a fight, unless they grew up watching more forgiving older macaques, in which case they tended to make up more quickly. Of course, we humans learn a lot from modeling. I mean, most of our popular culture is based on it. New slang, skinny jeans, foodie trends, pixie cuts. They're all racing around the globe through observation and imitation. So it makes a lot of sense that social observation shapes behavior, especially in children. Which brings us back to Bobo. Again, the fact that we learn by imitating even when we don't mean to seems pretty intuitive. But until Bandura's famous experiment, it hadn't been studied in a scientific way. I mean, these kids started abusing Bobo not just with little toddler punches, but with hostile language and even using things like toy guns that they previously had no interest in. And all because they saw aggressive modeling in action. And since Bandura's time, technology has allowed us to peer even deeper into this dynamic. Neuroimaging in humans, for instance, has shown that when an individual watches someone else, especially someone whom they relate to, receive an award or score a goal or something, their own brain's reward systems light up vicariously. Italian researchers found this out pretty much by accident in the early 1990s. They were studying signals from key regions in a lab monkey's brain that were associated with planning and doing. Their brain monitoring device buzzed softly when the monkey did something like pick up a piece of fruit and eat it. But one hot day, a researcher came back from lunch licking an ice cream cone and suddenly heard the animal's brain monitor buzz. The monkey was watching him, and his brain worked as if he was actually doing the licking. Many scientists suspect that this is the work of a previously unknown type of brain cell called mirror neurons, which fire when a subject both performs an action and when they observe someone else doing it. Mirror neuron research is still relatively new, and we're still figuring them out, but combined with Bandura's earlier work, it's revealing a strong connection between observation, imitation, and learning. So the takeaway here is models are important, and not just Giselle and Antonio Sabato Jr. You can, if you want, observe and imitate them. I'm just saying that observational social learning starts really early, and parental figures are powerful role models. Positive, supportive, and loving models usually prompt similar behavior in others, just as negative, aggressive modeling can spark antisocial effects. And as we'll talk about later, what we see and feel and learn as children is not easily displaced when we're adults. Literary giant George Bernard Shaw wrote, "Imitation is not just the sincerest form of flattery, it's the sincerest form of learning." And British statesman Lord Chesterfield once said, "We are, in truth, more than half what we are by imitation." Even if these ideas were only half true, they'd still be a powerful lesson on who you choose to spend your time with and how you choose to act. If you learned anything by watching me today, hopefully it involves involve the limitations of classical and operant conditioning, the basics of cognitive, observational, and social learning, a look at mirror neurons, and how to beat up a Bobo doll. Thanks for watching, especially to all of our Subbable subscribers who make this whole channel possible. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of Crash Course, get a special decal, or even be animated into an upcoming episode, just go to Subbable.com. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiBastino, and our consultant is Dr.
All right, so I'm going to stop that right there. And I think that really this crash course does a nice job of laying out for you exactly what social learning theory is all about, as well as the implications. So we'll just use our PowerPoint to kind of review some of that. So in terms of, the general principles underlying this theory, one big idea here is that people can learn by observing others' behavior and the consequences that result. And there's a cute little video here that I think I'll show you in a second, but you've got the link there. So the big idea is that, previously you learned about behaviorism, and what behaviorism is all about is how the consequences within your environment based on your own behavior, how does that change your perceptions, your future behavior, right? Here, Bandura tells us that, yeah, this behaviorism stuff is great, but also people are bringing something cognitive to the table. They can perceive and learn just by watching others experience consequences in the environment. So you can kind of see how we're beginning to float into cognitive theory a little bit here. So the big idea with this theory is that you don't always have to see a change in the person's behavior to know that learning occurred. So, I might pass someone who's pulled over by the police and, kind of register in my head that I really need to be monitoring my speed in my driving. I don't necessarily display that behavior right away, right? And it's not necessarily something that a behaviorist could observe there and then in that moment, but it doesn't mean that learning hasn't occurred. The other big idea here is that people have personal agency. And what that means is that people have the ability, to a certain extent, to control the environment in which they learn. So, we tend to take classes in things that we find more reinforcing or interesting. And in that way, we are manipulating our environment so that it is more maybe reinforcing. So there is this personal agency that people bring to the table that behaviorism didn't initially really acknowledge and recognize. So now I'm going to show you that super cute example of modeling. If I can get this to work here.
You almost got it. Oh, it's okay. Come on. Simon will show you. See? See? Simon, go show her again.
So you can see there that we have a really super cute example of how this dog can learn simply by watching the older dog, the more seasoned veteran upstairs. So what you kind of saw here is some intermittent reinforcement for imitating, right? So the pet owner here in the background is kind of reinforcing that older dog, the little dog seeing that and trying his best to kind of imitate that, right? And that's kind of this idea of generalized imitation. So in some ways, models in and of themselves kind of provide reinforcement to their imitators. And additionally, not only did that older dog kind of provide some reinforcement to little Daisy, but there was some third-party reinforcement involved as well. So this lady who has sort of an obnoxious voice is also doing lots of praise and encouragement in the background. So imitation in and of itself can lead to positive consequences, and that's kind of the environmental piece of this. The idea here is vicarious reinforcement and punishment. So you see that this is slightly different than behaviorism in that the big idea is that the person is not directly experiencing those reinforcing or punishing consequences. So with vicarious reinforcement, the learner observes someone else being reinforced for a behavior and then becomes more likely to mimic that behavior. So an example might be dressing like a celebrity that you feel like receives lots of attention, right? Or another example might be when teachers praise kids in the classroom who are behaving nicely, other kids magically start to behave appropriately like they're supposed to because they're witnessing other kids being reinforced for good behavior. Vicarious punishment. So the idea here would be that the learner is observing others being punished for a behavior, kind of like a cautionary tale. So seeing someone pulled over on the side of the road, receiving a fine, which is kind of punishing, is kind of that cautionary tale. It's vicarious punishment enough, usually, to get most of us to slow down. And then there's finally this idea of delayed imitation. So you might have been exposed to a model, but not really have an opportunity to imitate that behavior until some later point in time. And what we know is that people are obviously still able to do this. In terms of the cognitive factors involved with social learning theory, this is where behaviorism maybe fell short a little bit with their theory. So what Bandura adds to behaviorism is that sometimes we don't see the change, right? There's no clear objective behavioral change, but there is a mental change. And so people can describe behaviors and describe how they might complete a behavior that they've only observed. So this is the idea of vicarious acquisition. There are kind of specific cognitive processes that are necessary for learning, and we'll get into that in more depth in terms of the effectiveness of models. And then finally, one of the things that Bandura kind of figured out here is that, this idea of a response consequence to kind of evoke learning is a good one, but it really only works when the learner is aware of the consequences that someone is receiving or that they're meant to receive. So if it's unclear what the consequence is, then it's likely to not be either reinforcing or punishing. Bandura also kind of notes that one of the things we also bring to the table that can influence how reinforcing or punishing something is our expectations. So if we're expecting to receive some great reinforcement for something, some behavior we're engaging in, then that's going to influence how we behave. And so we're also bringing that to the table. And then finally, another contrast maybe to operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning is that oftentimes in that paradigm, learning comes after reinforcement has been delivered. In social cognitive theory, learning actually comes before the learner has been directly reinforced. So, in other words, the learner has seen a model maybe be reinforced or punishment, and so there's an incentive there. They're expecting something either reinforcing or punishing in the future, but it's not necessarily that they are going to be delivered that directly. Some other things in your book, it says people are less likely to pay attention to something when they don't expect a payoff for it. So this goes back to that idea of incentives and being aware of consequences. So people are definitely bringing that to the table, and that's influencing their environment and it's influencing their behavior. Bandura also talks a little bit about efficacy expectations, but we're going to save that for later in this podcast. And then one last kind of note in this area. So, in terms of expected consequences, in order for expected consequences to be kind of effective in terms of influencing future behavior, they have to actually happen, right? So even if you're expecting consequences, which might be reinforcing or punishing, if they don't happen, then it's going to decrease the likelihood that you're going to engage in that behavior in the future. So this is all probably pretty straightforward. What maybe is less straightforward is this idea of reciprocal causation. And so what reciprocal causation involves is first, you have a person, but the person is the product of both their environment and their behavior. And as I was alluding to before, all of these things sort of influence one another. So if the person expects their environment to be very reinforcing or very punishing, that's going to influence their behavior. And if they behave in a certain way, then the environment might respond accordingly, right? So if they engage in speeding more often, then they're more likely to come into contact with punishing consequences for that in their environment. So all of these kind of factors, behavior, environment, influence the person, and then the person influences both behavior and environment. And that's really kind of the crux of this theory. So I think I've already defined this to you, but what we mean by environment is that this is everything in the outside world. So any kind of reinforcements, punishments that the person receives or experiences. The person are those personal characteristics that are brought to the table and kind of how the outside world reacts to them. And then finally, behavior is how the person is perceived, what type of activities they engage in. All right, so now to get into modeling. Modeling involves a learner observing someone, typically a model, and mimicking it. So lots of learning happens this way. Modeling helps to teach new behaviors. Some good, some bad. We've done some research on modeling of anxiety for kids, and we know that a lot of anxiety development in kids comes from behaviors that are modeled by their parents. Just as one example. Modeling also increases the frequency of previously learned behaviors, so it can be either inhibiting, meaning that you see someone else engage in a behavior, and so now you're less likely to do that behavior in the future, or disinhibition, where you're now more likely to engage in a certain behavior because you saw someone else do it. And then it can also be involved with encouraging previously forbidden behaviors. So if everyone in your peer group is, engaging in maybe experimentation with substances, for example, even if previously you felt like, nah, that's not for me, the fact that so many of your peers around you are modeling this behavior, it might actually be sort of facilitative and disinhibiting to the point where you might actually begin to experience or experiment with those substances. And then finally, modeling can help to increase the frequency of similar behaviors. So something might be modeled for you, and you might not do it exactly like the model, but you might do it kind of similarly. Or take that model and apply it to a related behavior. So in terms of the characteristics of effective models, models really kind of need to be perceived as first competent. Sometimes having power or prestige can be helpful in making a model more effective, especially for kids when the model is behaving in kind of a gender stereotypical way. This can make the model more effective. And so for this reason, if we're wanting to break gender stereotypes, it's really important that we kind of present a model or a variety of models with a variety of behaviors to help kind of break down some of these stereotypes. And then the last point here is that the model really should be displaying a behavior that the learner feels like is relevant to them or their situation. So you might have a model who thinks they have a great idea for how you should do something, but if the learner is not buying it, the model is likely to be less effective. So in terms of behaviors that can be learned through modeling, academic skills are certainly behaviors that we model a lot, and we'll talk about some interventions that relate to that. Aggression is something that can be modeled. Interpersonal behavior, social skills, is something that is largely learned through modeling, through observing others. So what is necessary in order for someone to learn through modeling? Well, first, they have to be attending to the model, which is kind of a duh point here. They also, though, have to be able to retain what the model is demonstrating to them. And so there are two means of kind of enhancing retention. One is rehearsal. So practicing what was taught to you by the model over and over and over until you're proficient at it. Another thing that can support this is something we call memory codes. And so these are essentially mental labels of what needs to be remembered. And they can be either verbal or visual. In terms of motor reproduction, if this is part of the skill that's being modeled to you, it's helpful to both have motor reproduction and memory codes modeled. So an example might be learning memorable names for different dance moves as they're being taught to you. The ideal situation would have the learner performing the behaviors as they observe them, so that they can both encode the visual and the motor form. So a good example of this might be, if someone's trying to teach you a golf swing, it's, great to watch videos of that, but until you actually practice that and have names for each of the parts of a golf swing, it's probably not going to be all that helpful to have that modeled for you. So that's also kind of a necessary component. And then finally, motivation. So how motivated is the learner going to be to actually replicate the model? This matters. So I'm going to show you a fun video that demonstrates some motor reproduction and gives you some nice memory cues for remembering each of these steps. Let's see if I can get this to play.
Start with your heads down. Now look up slowly. Bring your arms up and bring them down. You're going to go up again, both arms, higher this time. Turn them down. Bring your thumbs to yourself. And down. Point your right hand from low to high. First your right hand. Now fist to your sides. Now your fingers, 5, 4. First, both hands. Up, punch, across. Crank, crank, stay down. Shoulder, chin, shoulder, and tap. Double dream hands, and thumbs to yourself. Punch again. Now point your right hand from low to high. Punch, crank underhanded. 2 taps, shoulder, double dream hands. Just like before. Crank. Stay down. Shoulder, chin, shoulder, shoulder, shoulder.
Okay, so we'll stop it there. But I think that's a nice, funny example of how, using different codes like double dream hands helps to make these moves much more memorable. Now, the ideal again would be if you were actually practicing these moves along with him. So now we're going to kind of begin to end the podcast by differentiating between self-efficacy, self-regulation, self-concept, and self-esteem. So self-concept is kind of your overall understanding of yourself. So this idea of I think, therefore I am. Whereas self-esteem might be more of an evaluation or a value we place on ourselves. I think I'm good. Self-efficacy, which Bandura talks quite a bit about, is more of a specific understanding of our ability in an area. So kind of the I think I can mentality. In terms of self-efficacy and how that relates to behavior and cognition, our self-efficacy is going to influence the types of activities we engage in. So in particular, we're going to be more likely to engage in things that we feel like we're going to have success at. It influences our goals, our ability to persist in the face of challenges, and the amount of effort that we put into something. And finally, self-efficacy definitely influences our learning and our achievement. So even when skill levels are equal, someone who's higher in self-efficacy is going to perform better. So it kind of gives you a little edge, and the translation here is that sometimes being a little overconfident is actually a good thing. You don't want to be too overconfident because then you might kind of rest on your laurels and not engage in the amount of effort you need to. But being a little confident is a good thing. So how can we develop better self-efficacy? Some of the things that influence the development of self-efficacy is first the successes and failures we've been exposed to. So once high self-efficacy is developed, having a little failure from time to time isn't necessarily devastating, right? And this is kind of the idea of resilient self-efficacy, that it's okay to challenge ourselves and experience a failure here and there because overall we feel pretty good about our ability to do things. Our current emotional state can influence our self-efficacy. So if you have a number of things going on in your life that are contributing to you experiencing some negative emotions, then you might even perceive that as kind of not having a great ability, even if the source of that emotion is something like a breakup, for example. It might influence your feelings about how well you might do on a test, for example, or your ability to do well on a test. So that's also something to keep in mind. Messages from others can have an influence on the development of self-efficacy. So if someone's constantly telling you what a failure you are or criticizing you, that is going to obviously lead to a lower self-efficacy. And kind of when you flip that, so if someone's constantly telling you how wonderful you are and how much you can achieve, if you're not actually experiencing success to match that, then eventually that person just won't be seen as credible anymore, and you will likely not consider that information. And then the successes and failures of others. So, if you're seeing peers succeed or fail, especially, I mean, you guys know this better than I do, when you're talking to peers about what classes to take, that's going to strongly influence whether or not you feel like you will also be successful in those classes. And another thing that sometimes fits within this area is something we call a coping model. So being able to see a peer struggle through something and master it can help you to also struggle through something and conquer that as well. And so I've provided a link to you there if you want to check out a fun video from Game of Thrones. And then finally, successes and failures of the group as a whole. We call this collective self-efficacy. So if everybody in a class feels like they're going to fail, then there might be collectively low self-efficacy about being able to succeed in a course, and vice versa. So now we're going to get into self-regulation. And so what self-regulation is all about is after an individual has set goals or standards for themselves, they engage in a process to help them kind of succeed in meeting those goals or standards. So first they might engage in self-observation, where they kind of take a look at what's been working well for them, what maybe needs improvement. They might engage in self-evaluation, which is oftentimes facilitated by being evaluated by others, where they then say, you know, okay, this has been going well, this needs improvement. Well, have I really been putting all of the effort into studying for the exam that I should be? Have I been making flashcards? Um, and from there, they might engage in self-reaction, where they either reinforce themselves and say, yeah, I've been nailing it with the flashcards and taking notes for this class. Or they might punish themselves as well. And so they might say, you know what, no more going out until I master this whole flashcard studying for my exams thing. And this is really based on the personal standards they've set for themselves. So some students might be great with a C, they might be fine with that. And then other students might not. That might be too low of a standard for themselves. And then finally, after kind of engaging in this process and adjusting and calibrating, they might engage in the process of self-reflection. So they look at the bigger picture, they see how their, progress towards these goals is maybe even meeting a larger goal in their life, like getting a college degree, for example. So Meichenbaum has applied this to a number of different areas where people need self-regulation. And in particular, he's applied this work to anger management. So when we're teaching kids anger management, these are the steps that Meichenbaum says we should engage in. So first, we should provide them with a cognitive model. So I might have a group of kids who are struggling with anger management, and I might create a situation where I say, I became really angry when this situation popped up. Let me talk you through how I problem solved addressing it. So in step 2, I would provide overt guidance here. So I would verbalize the instructions to the child and then have them begin to talk themselves through it. Once they were pretty proficient at that, a kind of engaging in the problem solving I modeled for them with my prompting, then I would encourage them to perform the same problem solving procedure, but this time, instead of me prompting them, they're actually going to be repeating the instructions aloud to themselves. And then in step 4, they would continue this process of practicing what had been modeled for them, but now they're just kind of maybe in their head repeating the instructions to themselves or kind of softly whispering them. And in the last step, they would be performing this proficiently kind of on their own without any need to maybe walk themselves through all of the instructions. So this is Meichenbaum's model for promoting self-regulation, and it's really based on Bandura's work in modeling. So how can we promote more self-regulating behavior? First, encouraging students or learners to self-monitor. So an example of this might be when I work with kids with ADHD, oftentimes we will have a procedure. We might provide that student with a watch that vibrates on certain intervals where they're supposed to ask themselves, have I been on task? And this is just a nice kind of gauge of, wait a minute, am I meeting my goals here? Am I actually, doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And that's part of self-regulation. And then finally, self-reinforcement. And we've talked about the Premack principle previously, but maybe we say, you know what, I've been really distracted with Facebook when I was studying. First, I'm going to get all of my studying done, then I'll allow myself to open Facebook and play around on Facebook, right? We might also do something like self-imposed stimulus control. So if I know that when I work in my room or study in my room, I tend to fall asleep, then I'm going to use some self-imposed stimulus control. And in particular, I'm going to go somewhere where I know that there is good stimulus control over my behavior. So what we mean by stimulus control is that studying behaviors, in this case, are emitted in the presence of some stimuli, but not others. So, laying in my bed and doing studying doesn't really promote studying. But when I go to the library, there's something about that stimuli of the library, that environment, that makes it much more likely I'm going to study. So the library has some stimulus control over my studying behaviors. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Um, the other thing to recognize here is that sometimes behaviors are only going to occur in certain environments. And so if we know that to be true, then we can use this information to either increase or decrease a behavior. So one example of this is something I call the Daily Behavior Report Card, and you'll find this in the literature. It actually has really big effect sizes. So what this is a student keeps a list of behaviors or rules that they need to follow throughout the day, and they typically keep this at their desk. After each period, the teacher checks in with them to see if the student met the rule for that period. If they did, they get a happy face. If they didn't, then maybe they get an X, something like that. If the student meets the goal for the day, which might mean a certain number of happy faces, then they can earn a reward in school, and sometimes even at home, just kind of depends. But either way, we encourage the student to bring the card home to show the parents kind of what their rule following behavior was in school that day. So as I mentioned, this intervention is very effective. It's meant to help students, particularly with ADHD, self-monitor their behavior throughout the day, but it's also found to not only help with teaching self-monitoring, but also to increase compliance with class rules and to improve overall performance, especially academically. So Van Nest and colleagues did a meta-analysis on this intervention in 2010, and they found an effect size of 0.61, which is considered to be very, very effective when it comes to school-based interventions. So this is kind of what this looks like. You see the periods of the day or of the school day broken down across the top, and then the 3 rules that this kid needs to follow throughout each period. So during arrival and morning work, was I paying attention to the teacher? Was I following the rules? And did I finish my work? So the teacher would check in with the student at the end of that period and provide happy faces if the student was on task, or maybe provide a medium face or a sad face, depending on how off task they were. So you can see at the bottom there's a nice gradient. And basically, if they, at least 80% of that interval or period were engaging in that behavior, they should be given a happy face. So again, what I said is that we would set a goal, this student needs to receive 12 out of however many happy faces every day in order to, get extra computer time at the end of the day or to obtain a prize at home when they go home. And that is it for today. So that was kind of our educational implication. What I'd like you to do now is go to the discussion board and make your post for this chapter.